little bit about Dr. Brian Grass, who has spent the last 14 years as an elementary school principal at several schools, right? In Los Angeles, New Mexico, and currently in the Palm Springs area. You are the principal at an elementary school called Benjamin Franklin Elementary School. I am sure they are stoked to have you there. Under your tenure, it says you actually had 2 schools achieve the California Distinguished School Award for Arts and Academics and for closing the achievement gap. Dr. Grass also received his doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Southern California. Wow. And wrote his dissertation on the study of the how and why of elementary leadership in schools with effective autism inclusion programs. That's amazing.
Yes. Well, thank you.
Yes, it is.
I wouldn't say it's amazing, but it sounds impressive. That's for sure.
It is.
It is
impressive. Along the lines of some of the special ed programming you've been involved with, what have you implemented in your school that's different or unique?
When it comes to special education, there's really nothing new under the sun. With special education programming in elementary schools, it's really all about relationships. It's not about new and shiny. It's about good first teaching, and it's about really treating your professionals like professionals and making sure that they have everything they need, making sure they're well trained. And when they're well trained and they are there for kids, honestly, you just get out of their way and let them do the job that they know how to do. And really, my job is to facilitate their success, make sure that they're doing right by kids, and to help parents understand how to navigate the system. That's really my job. And so I've not done anything really adventurous at any of my schools other than try to keep our programs running as efficiently and as smartly as possible. Because I think when you get in and try to really recreate the wheel, you can really monkey up the system, because it needs to be simple, right? Because it's about relationships, and it's about dealing with kids where they are, not where you think they need to be. Because you've got to see and celebrate kids where they are right this very minute, and understand that they're capable of making progress. Every kid makes different levels of progress. And so you've just got to be present with what they're doing right then and there. Yeah. And so I think building really effective collaborative teams at schools is something that I've done well, and that I really think is worth the time and effort. The training for professionals to really learn their craft and to be able to deliver solid pedagogy that meets the kids' needs, and to give them time and resources to meet together and to plan real effective inclusion. Because remember, it should be a nice marriage between general education and special education. There is no child there's no child with special education needs in a public education setting that doesn't have a significant amount of general education in their daily diet. When they're fully sequestered away from the general education population, they don't do as well. I mean,
I've heard a lot about that. Yeah. Thanks for answering that so completely and then some.
I'd like to actually take us back. You had said one of your initial jobs is to help parents navigate the system.
Yep.
And I know as a parent myself, that system can be intimidating and scary. And I would love to know, when a parent has the first inkling that their child may need additional help or something isn't quite right, how do they approach the school? What's their path look like?
That's a really good question. And it really does depend where in the stage they are as far as their child goes. The younger the child, the harder the first hurdles can be for a parent, right? Because here's something that's really important for all of us to understand. This job requires a ton of compassion, because society and everything has trained us to believe that our child is going to turn out to be one way, which is amazing, right? Which, I mean, just purely amazing. And when they're not typically developing, and a parent starts to realize early on that certain milestones are not being met or certain barriers are not being overcome, the stress starts to set in, right? And I mean, all parents, no parent has an easy road of it, right? Regardless. But when there's a possible disability, when there's limitations or delays in a child's development, parents can get really run through it. It can tear up marriages. It can really shake parents' foundations of what they consider their own reality almost, right? And so
Yeah.
by the time they get to us in elementary school, they pretty much know there's stuff going on. And now they're in that kind of frantic mode where they're trying to navigate a brand new system, and they're trying to assess their kid, and they're trying not to give up hope, and they're trying to like beat the clock, because again, your child is growing so fast. And as a parent, if you feel like you're not getting your child to where they need to be at certain age levels, they're going to fall behind, and then they're going to be behind forever, or they're not going to make certain, they're not.
Yeah.
As parents, we're like, they're never going to marry, they're never going to go to prom, they're never, you know what I mean? So suddenly we catastrophize a lot around our kids. And so it can be really intimidating for parents to come into a situation because already they're fighting kind of a fight for their lives. And so the last thing on their mind at that moment might be nuance, right? Or subtlety. And so when we get kids, it really depends on where they're at, and it depends on what's going on with them, because it can be a whole range of issues, right? It can be a disability, it could be a disorder, it could be a health impairment, it could be a cognitive impairment. And so that's the big step. That's the first big thing, is trying to figure out exactly what is going on with your kiddo and trying to learn how to trust a system that may or may not look like they have your best interest at heart,
Oh,
right?
100%. Yeah.
100%.
And think about
because
the school is like the front line of the whole dynamic, or in some
Right.
cases, it looks like a big storm. So you guys are
Right.
getting the big mess of emotions and everything.
Well, and how often does the school actually, are they the deliverer of the message?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Well, because oftentimes we're the first one to officially say what
Yeah.
parents have been afraid of all that time. And so we're easy to point out as the scapegoats or the idiots or the bad guys or the ones who, that's, again, remember when I said my job is to facilitate that relationship. Trust is huge. Trust is huge.
Right.
And so if my team does a half-assed job, or if we do something that turns out to be disinformation, parents don't trust us anymore. And then the job just got 3 times harder, because ultimately the kid is going to suffer, because what the kid needs is the kid needs services in some form or another, probably, or some sort of accommodation so that they can learn. Because ultimately the child needs to learn, and the child can only learn really in the school setting. Parents can opt for a private school setting, but really, most parents, 95% of parents, really need to go the public school route. And luckily, we live in America where the federal government guarantees, the Constitution actually guarantees, that your children will be educated free of charge from 3 to 18. And anything that they need to access that learning will be provided to you for free, regardless.
That's a right. Those are
That's
our
a
rights.
right. That is not a privilege. That is a right. Just getting parents to understand that piece is hard as
I never
huge.
knew that. Yeah.
And then getting them to understand that just because it's a right doesn't mean it comes automatic, right? Or doesn't mean that just because you've got a car coming to you doesn't mean you're getting a Porsche. And so that's another piece, right? Dang it.
Gosh.
So ultimately, what we're talking about is, what does your child need to access the learning? Not what does your child need to live free of pain or suffering or stress, but what does your child need to access the learning at school? And so that's another big piece.
The tools in specific, like the 504 and the IEP, that a parent can utilize to help their child get access to learning. How do they, one, start that process? But then two, the biggest thing is, what's the difference between the two?
Big questions. And those are good questions, really good questions. No. They're really good
He's
questions.
on vacation, Andrea.
I'm sorry.
And ultimately, for this podcast to be helpful to your listeners, this is something that they're all going to have as questions. And this is the question we get all the time.
Yeah.
The tools you have to utilize as a parent to get your kid help are the IEP, which stands for Individualized Educational Plan or Program, or a 504, right? And these are both aspects of the IDEA law, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And these are really important aspects of the law. Like I said, it's a right, not a privilege. They're very different because one is more difficult and nuanced than the other. So if your child has any sort of disability, physical, learning, whatever, and it limits their ability to learn, they might be eligible for an individualized educational plan. Because what we need to do as a team, we need to figure out what does your child need to access the learning, because they're not doing the learning like all their other typical peers. They need something else, whatever it might be, right? They're limited. And so if they are eligible with a disability, they can get an IEP. So a disability is when generally a psychologist or a medical professional finds that there is something limiting the child's ability to access life. And with respect to learning and with respect to accessing school, there are 13 disabilities that that we look for. And if the child has any of those disabilities, then they could probably get an IEP. And we're talking like physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, sensory disabilities, mental illnesses, neurological disabilities. But there are 13 very specific ones. And that's what psychologists look for.
So do they have to have a diagnosis then to get an IEP?
A diagnosis is a medical aspect. So no, psychologists do not diagnose. They present their findings after much assessment, and they can provide children with a label of a disability. So I don't know if you'd call that a diagnosis, honestly, because if your child is found to be presenting enough aspects of the autism spectrum disorder, then we can label them with an autism disability. Does that make sense? If your child is unable to access the hearing portion of their learning, and the audiologist finds that they're limited in their hearing more than 80%, let's say, then they can be labeled with a deaf or hard of hearing disability. So there are these labels, basically, these 13 labels that we can put onto a child so that they're eligible for an IEP. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it can be physical. There's an umbrella term called other health impairment, OHI. Sometimes you'll have ADHD will fit into that. Sometimes other types of learning disabilities may fit into that. You could have a physical disfigurement or a physical disability, which might allow for them to get a label of a disability. You could have a traumatic brain injury. You could be visually impaired. You could have a speech or language impairment. Any of these might get you different types of disabilities, which will allow for an IEP. Okay? More than likely, the parents listening to this who have questions, it won't be very straightforward, right? It won't be a super straightforward situation where, oh, I've known since he was 2 that he's probably on the autism spectrum. Oh, we've known since he was 3 that he's blind. Oh, you know what I mean? It may not be. Oftentimes, the hard ones, they're not very clear. We're just not sure what's going on.
Because and they change a lot, it sounds like, too.
They change as they grow, too.
Yeah.
So it could be something that is more of a disorder, to use a more clinical term. Because remember, if it's not fitting into one of the 13 disability categories, they can still get help via a 504 plan. And they could have a health issue or something that affects their life. Think asthma, think attention, think something that significantly affects their ability to learn, but isn't necessarily a disability. You could say an anxiety disorder might be a good one to play with, because it doesn't necessarily fit nicely under a disability that a psychologist would say, oh, that's a disability, right?
Yeah.
But it may significantly limit their ability to learn. right? They may be missing out on a lot of school. They may not be able to do PE with their peers. They may not be able to do recess with their peers. Who knows? They may not be able to take tests. You name it. There's a million different reasons why they may not be accessing the learning. So if that's the case, if it's not one of the 13 disabilities that a psychologist would find, then it might be something that's eligible for a 504 plan. And a 504 plan is really kind of like an IEP with no teeth almost, right? Because a 504 plan doesn't come attached with money from the federal government. So there's no special education teacher attached to a 504 plan, right? If a child is struggling with accessing the learning, but they don't have a special education disability, they still need help. The help is going to come from the school. The help is going to still come from the team at school. There just won't be a special education manager attached to the child helping them to access. It may be more of the school counselor or the general education teacher along with the assistant principal, or you name it. And a 504 plan could just be designed to help them access their learning on a day-to-day basis based on their need.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here for just a minute, because I'm a parent now that just heard that the 504 is the IEP with no teeth. So I'm thinking, whoa, I want to make sure my kid gets the IEP because there's no funding that goes with it.
Sure.
Help me believe that the 504 is going to be helpful to my child as well.
Yep. And again, remember what we talked about, the Porsche versus the car, right?
Right.
What are we talking about? This is your child, right? In your mind, your child deserves only the best.
The Porsche.
The Porsche. But is the Porsche necessary to drive down the road? No. We just want to get your child down the road, right? We don't need to get them down the road in style. So if the team finds that it's not necessary for them to have all the bells and whistles with money attached in order to learn, then we're not going to advise that, because that would be fiscally and almost morally irresponsible of us to assign your child a special education case manager, a teacher, services, minutes of the day, yada, 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 if they don't need that to learn, right? So let's take two kids. Let's take a kid with asthma and a kid with ADHD. This is broad ballpark stuff here, right?
Yeah.
So don't take my word for it. This is not not every kid with ADHD gets an IEP, right? That is just not the case. But in this situation, we've got child A and child B. Both children are not learning. Both children are struggling to learn. The child with asthma, child B, is never making it to school, unable to play at recess, unable to go out for PE, unable to keep up with his peers, missing a ton of school, not learning, but due to asthma, let's say, okay?
Yeah.
The other child A, has attention deficit disorder. It's diagnosed by a doctor. It's real. They're taking medication, but they're still struggling, right? And they are just not making progress, and they are not accessing the learning. So most likely, the ADHD will more than likely provide them a disability eligibility. A psychologist would probably be able to fit them in under the category of OHI, which is other health impairment, because they could seriously utilize some major support from the team, because they're truly not accessing, because they've already gotten medication, they've already gotten all this other stuff, and they're still not learning, right? And so you almost want to pull out the big guns, right? And say, this kid really needs more help than just the diagnosis, the medication, the extra time on tests. It's just not working. They need more. And so an IEP becomes more appropriate at that point, because they just need to learn and access and make their progress. The kid with asthma, the kid's got the inhaler. The kid doesn't need a full-blown team around them, because turns out if we give the kid the inhaler and the time to go to the office and use the inhaler when they need it, and to make sure that the teachers around them know to monitor them when they're running around a lot, then they actually end up doing just fine. And they're able to access the learning quite well. And so they don't need the full-blown team around them. They don't need a psychologist. They don't need a counselor. They don't need a special education teacher, because they're able to learn really with no problem. They just need to be in school. And in order to get them in school, we provide them the inhaler and everything else and the time to use it and the place to use it. Good to go. So that's a perfect example of where the needs were so great that an IEP team really needs to hang out around child A and work on their goals and really spend time every year revamping. Child B really just needed some tweaks, right? And needed to make sure that they got what they need to succeed. Now, if child B were to move around from school to school, we would hate to have to relearn this asthma thing every time. So the 504 allows for the parents and the kid to go through this kind of once, get it in writing so that it follows the kid, so that every school has to honor it. And so when I say no teeth, I mean maybe no money. Maybe that's a better way to use it because it does have teeth. It's a 504 and you have to legally follow it. It's signed off on by the parents. It's a mandate. And when a kid walks in a 504, you have to follow it. It's just that simple. But it doesn't come attached with special education dollars, and it doesn't come attached with a lot of services and a lot of people. That's what the IEP does. And so really what it comes down to is level of need. There's an important piece to understand here, and it's called a free and appropriate public education. So when I talked about the Porsche, what I talk about is the level of appropriateness, because again, we're talking about a public school setting. We're talking about tax dollars at work. And in order for us not to bankrupt a public setting, we've got to be judicious about the monies that we do spend. That doesn't mean that we scrimp on kids who need it. We don't scrimp on kids who need it. We give kids who need things everything they need. What we don't do is we don't provide a Porsche for a kid who just needs a car. And so when you talk about a free and appropriate public education, that's what we're talking about.
That makes sense.
If a parent still feels that their child needs more than the team thinks they do, and again, the team doesn't think this because they just feel like it, they think it based on data. The assessment data says your child is making progress. It may not be making the progress you want the child to be making, but they're making progress. Then we're at a crossroads. And then a parent really might disagree with us and say, no, my child needs more. Okay. And then we get into difficulties around due process and kind of fighting the system. Hopefully we never get there. Hopefully we trust each other enough that we can kind of sit in these meetings and work on what our kiddo needs and what does the data say, where are they at right now? Because it's all about where are they at right now. Remember what I said, we meet the kid where they're at, not where we want them to be in 5 years, but we meet them right where they're at now and we move them along slowly but surely.
So I've heard that the trend, it could have been from a discussion with you at an earlier time, that the trend is that we don't hold children back anymore. So when a parent has in their mind, oh my gosh, my child is in second grade, by the end of second grade, he should be at third grade level, and it's not getting there, or he or she's not getting there. What are some of the markers that you're looking at so that you can set the expectation with the parent that, yes, the child is progressing to a point where we're doing our job,
Right.
but maybe not to that third grade level?
Yeah, for sure. We don't hold kids back. It doesn't work. Studies are very clear now. The detriment done to kids over time is greater than the benefit because there's so many other factors with a child spending their time outside of their peer group. So studies show that kids need to be amongst their peers, their same age peers. It's a very important concept for their learning. They're most relaxed that way. They're most able to learn that way. And so keeping them behind psychologically, it's a huge hit. It's a huge blow to kids. And the benefits of them kind of going through the same material again just doesn't realize itself. It just doesn't come through. And so we do still use it occasionally, but it's got to be a special case. It's got to be very young, usually first grade-ish, and it's got to be where the kid's got to be kind of physically small, maybe really emotionally immature, so that an additional year in that grade doesn't really seem to affect them too much. It's an intervention that you want to use very sparingly.
When did that sort of thinking change?
About 10, 15 years ago. It's hard
Right about
because,
when we had my son repeat kindergarten.
but again, if you're going to repeat, kinder or first is a pretty good place to do it.
Oh, it
And
is?
like I
Okay.
said, it is done. And like I said, in the right circumstance, it can be great. So I'm not telling you that it's bad across the board. It's just not. Remember, these are kids. They're not widgets. Kids are individuals. You just can't use the same brush to paint all these pictures. Each one
Yeah.
is super individual. And so what works for one doesn't always work for another. And so as a result, we just don't use that as an intervention like we used to.
I was
And so
feeling like
what,
total crap listening to you say how
not at
bad it
all,
was. Like,
not at all, not at all.
oh my
And
gosh.
here's the important thing, right? Where's your kid now?
Mine?
How's your kid now?
He's good. Well, now he's good.
Okay.
He's entering senior year in high school, and it
Okay.
seems like that's great. But I think about some of the things socially where he's so much older
Sure.
than his peers, and that's been a
Sure.
little
Sure.
that's shown up a little
Sure.
bit, you know.
Sure, 100%, right? 100%. And as parents, you make decisions, right? And you just hope that you're doing the right thing, but you got to step
Yeah.
away from it. Once the decision's made, you do have to step away. I'll go on a tiny tangent here. I talk to parents often about the concept of engineer versus shepherd. Have you heard this?
No?
No, share.
Parents, the best type of parenting, in my opinion, and what all the reading I've done, the best type of parenting are shepherds. Your little sheep is born and they're the sheep. They're done. They're born. All you can do from that moment on is shepherd them through life. All you
Yeah.
can do is guide them. The people who think they are the engineers.
Can you do that from your helicopter?
The people who think they're engineering their child's lives for day to day, right? Have to get in there and monkey with every moment of their child's life because
Yeah.
they think they're creating a kid brick by brick. And that is just not, in my opinion, a super healthy way to raise a kid because it doesn't give them any autonomy. It doesn't give them any faith or trust. And as a result, they grow up to be really stressed out adults who are unable to take risks or who are unable to really stand up on their own. You know what I mean? And so this concept of shepherding versus engineering, I think, is a really powerful message. And I try
It's
to
a
give
nice
it to my
visual.
parents.
Yeah.
Try to give it to my parents all the time. It's not mine. I'd like to take responsibility for it, but it's not. I've read it. And it's important because I think in this day and age, I think our generation especially, we looked at our parents who were the boomer generation, and we saw that they did a lot of things quite wrong in our opinion, right? They were very hands-off.
Yeah.
They would let us
They were
leave
the
the house.
sleeping shepherd.
Yeah, they would let us leave the house at 12 in the afternoon and not come back until 9 at night when the streetlights came on. And we'd like to put a lot of our problems on that, but the reality is it probably wasn't such a bad thing actually because
Yeah.
we
That's a good
learned
point.
to take care of ourselves, right? We
Yeah.
learned to be really
Yep.
self-sufficient. And so as a result, our generation as adults, we're very functioning. We're high functioning adults where we've got intense careers and we're taking care of our parents and taking care of our kids. So I think we can kind of overcompensate by trying to really micromanage our kids' lives. And I
Yeah.
don't think it's super necessary. I think we can trust our kids a little bit more.
Yeah, it's
Well,
so
and I
true.
think-
These things happen and we have the best intention, but I
course.
can absolutely see how we've evolved as a generation of parents of just doing too much sometimes.
Everything for our kids.
Yeah.
I remember my dad, who grew up in South Georgia, not wearing shoes because they couldn't afford them. He saw my husband telling the kids once not to rub their hand across a railing because they were going to get a splinter. And my dad was like, let him get the splinter. I used to walk in the fields with no shoes on, and I learned not to walk when, there was a bush that had pricklies. He says, I learned that. And I was, so now that actually instilled confidence in, not in my husband, but in my children. That they could look at the situation.
Yeah. The elementary schools in Japan are famous for, especially the kindergartens, for having big boulders in the courtyard and big trees to climb on. And the concept is that if they don't learn their limits early in life, and if they don't get hurt early in life, what we found, and there are studies, and I read really interesting papers when I was doing my dissertation on risk-taking in young adults.
Yeah.
And the less risk they're exposed to as children, the more risk they're willing to take as young adults. And when you put a boy in a car at 16 who's never learned his limits, chances are good that he's going to get very, very hurt. So as a parent, you'd almost rather he falls and scrapes his knee than gets in a twisted fender bender when he's 18 years old at 100 miles an hour.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
So there's that concept too, is like step back, let them make mistakes, let them get hurt. It's okay. They're not going to die.
Yeah, you said it right there. That's it. Is let them get hurt. That's what
Let
is
them
so
get hurt.
hard.
Let them get hurt. To bring it back to our conversation, one of the bigger challenges we have is for parents to trust us in that what we're advocating for your child is just for them not to get hurt, right? You cannot protect them. They are going to have to experience the world, right, with the disability, which means equine therapy is not appropriate. Dolphin therapy is not appropriate.
What?
Having an emotional support dog on their lap in class, it's not appropriate because
do people
it's just,
do that now?
Uh-huh. And
oh, really?
it's just
Kids?
well,
Wow.
and again, and I'm not going to denigrate something that other people have found to be appropriate or useful, but I'm telling you that for your child to feel really whole and healthy, they need to feel like they're part of the general education setting with as few limits as possible. One of the things, and I'll get into, and this is one of my harps, and I have data to back this up. Parents, when they find out their child has a disability or a problem or a struggle or a challenge, they've heard that there are adults that you can put on the kid called a one-on-one assistant. And they come in with this need that their child needs a one-on-one, their child needs an assistant, their child needs a whatever. And what we found is that the more you put in between your child and the general education setting, the more your child will be limited in their ability to grow and change healthily. They've done some studies. Kids who have an adult attached to them all day long grow far more disconnected from their same age peers than kids who don't have an adult, but who have regular services with a special education teacher, like for an hour a day, let's say. And so again, we sit in meetings where parents tell us what they want, but we show them the data and we say, but that's not appropriate for your child to make progress, right? Because that's what we want. We want your child to make progress.
This one-on-one person is different from a parent advocate, right? That's not the same thing.
Yes. So a one-on-one service is really a kind of a para-professional or a para-educator, almost a teacher assistant who's a special education person who's assigned to the child from the moment they walk into school to the moment they leave. Right. Okay. And it was used a lot in the late 80s, all through the 90s, into the 2000s. It's still used. It's still used because many kids still do very much need it. Some kids can be a real danger to themselves. Some kids it can be really stressful for adults and kids around them because they have so many behaviors that are really injurious. So sometimes an adult is necessary to kind of shadow the kid. But for the most part, really not appropriate, especially in a general education setting.
Interestingly enough, Emmy, do you remember we had a guest on a couple of weeks ago whose son is on the autism spectrum? And she had brought that up. She had said that her son had a one-on-one for a while, but the other children didn't or couldn't approach him. So it was
that's right.
It was actually segregating him.
It was isolating.
It was isolating and not allowing him to develop socially at a child's level. And so she actually advocated to remove that so that he could experience better social skills and such.
That's right.
So,
and you can imagine how tempting it'd be for a parent, a scared parent who's already racked with guilt, right?
Right.
They're like, oh, you can attach an adult to my kid? Awesome. That means I can be there with my kid all day while I'm at work, basically. And so the parent then has these conversations with the adult all day, right? Where this adult is co-parenting their kid all day at school. And that's just the worst possible thing you can do for a child. And so you can see how easy it would be for parents who are stressed or who are not sure to fall down the rabbit hole, especially with the internet, of what their child really should be getting versus what the school is telling them.
Mm.
Throw in a little distrust for whatever reason, and then it's almost impossible to get parents to understand where we're coming from as a public education setting, that what's appropriate for your child does not look like the bells and whistles you see online. I'm glad you brought up advocates. Advocates are hugely important, right? Because advocates can really help parents navigate a very scary situation. And there are plenty of schools who probably aren't doing the best job. And so sometimes an advocate is necessary. But I can also say that an advocate is there to make money. And so an advocate's really getting paid when there's conflict, because the advocate is going to advocate for the parent through the child, and we're going to advocate for the child. And so when the two don't meet directly, then there's conflict. And that's when the advocate is billable hours is hourly billable. So, think about that. They're basically a lawyer.
Yeah.
So how does a parent enter into the situation? And I don't know, obviously you've got to build their trust and such, but how do you come in as a parent and be effective for your child and think that you're doing the best that you can and not go overboard?
And I started the conversation with this. It's relationships. It's all about relationships. Trust is difficult. Trust is built. Trust is not earned overnight. As a parent, look at the actions of the people at the school, right? Look, do they match the words? That's number one. Go for a vibe check. Do you get the feeling in your stomach that this feels right? Does that classroom feel good for your kid? Don't ask the child. Don't ask a child what they want. Please don't do that. Look at the adults, look at the data, right? Have them show you what they're talking about and give it a chance. If they say that this is what they think and you are skeptical, be clear about your skepticism. There's a classic concept about interaction with adults is speak to be understood and then listen to understand, which means when they tell you things, really try to hear what they're saying. And when you need to be clear about something, make sure you're being really understood and take advantage of every communication opportunity, because schools will really overload the parent with opportunities to meet and communicate. Many parents don't take advantage of all that. And then when there's a crisis, there's stress. Take advantage, go in early, make phone calls, do those emails, check in weekly. It's amazing how connected you can feel to your school and to your kids' team when you do little things like that. And again, show up ready to learn and to be present. And again, give everybody a chance. And if they screw up their chance, if they lie to you, if they do the opposite of what they're saying, lawyer up, screw them, lawyer up, get advocates, because this is your kid and your kid deserves the very best. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
I was going to ask you, what if it's not going well? What if you cannot see eye to eye?
Get an advocate. Go online, talk to your friends, find a really solid advocate, and just get your needs met. Communicate with the special education department at your child's school district. They don't have any horse in the race. They'll rain holy hell down on that school. Put everything in writing. Nothing is just verbal. Everything is in writing.
Well, I would imagine the school's doing the same thing.
Absolutely. If they know what they're doing, they do. Parents have more power than they have any concept about. If they rattle a cage, oh my God, everybody listens. School board members are incredibly powerful. There's generally only 5 or 6 of them for the entire school district. Get to know one, just one, so that they know your name. When you're in trouble, that board member will help you out. Because you elected them.
That's great advice. Yeah.
You elected them. You hired them, you elected them. Their job is to run a school district for your kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you get to know a school board member?
Go to the school board meetings, find out who they are. They work in the community, and then write to them, write an email and say, hey, I'd love to have a coffee with you. They'll usually do meet and greets at the schools. Get a chance to kind of meet with them one-on-one or just have an email conversation with them. You'd be surprised. They're constituents, right? They're elected officials. They want to meet you and just get to know them and say, remember, my child has autism. My child is at Ben Franklin Elementary. Remember, remember, remember. My
Mm-hmm.
name is Emmy, and I will be needing you at some point, probably.
That's
You
great.
know,
That's
and then an
great
email from
advice.
Emmy, and suddenly everybody is on tap. What is going on
Mm-hmm.
with Emmy's daughter at, Ben Franklin? What is happening? The
Right.
principal's on the phone. I've got the principal on his cell phone on a weekend. Oh yeah. Oh yes. Oh yes.
Oof.
Trust. Trust.
What would you like to see improve in the public school system with regard to how these situations can unfold?
God, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer. I really don't have a good answer for that because it's so individual. The thing I'd like to see improve, obviously, are situations where families have really bad experiences, right? Or they've
Yeah.
gotten really distrustful. And it can turn into such a nightmare of legal troubles and all kinds of things. Because once the trust is lost, it can be really hard to get it back. I think the best thing for any school district to do is to make sure that their special education department is run by the very best people, the smartest people, because
Mm-hmm.
if that's the case, then that means all their people are well trained, right? Because that's really what you need is you need a really well run, well organized special education department or a school district that really understands the role of special education.
Well, you know,
So,
you bring up something that I had never really thought about until just now, which is the school board and the school district bring a continuity that is not there throughout a parent and child's um, tenure with the school district. So I would imagine at every point, whether you're going from elementary school to middle school to high school, there are these anxiety points
yep,
during the transition.
yep,
And
yep,
the middle school and the high school, they're completely separate
yep,
entities, yet the
yep,
school board and the district are continuous.
It's a great
correct.
point.
It's a
Yeah.
great point. And like I said about the leadership of the special education department, right? So if you know somebody or if you've made relationships with the people in the Department of Special Education, they cover elementary, middle, and high. They're there
Yeah.
for you all the time. If
Yeah.
you make relationships with the director of instruction, they are overseeing all of the schools. If you talk to the superintendent of your school district, they should know who you are. They're never
Yeah.
too busy for you. That's their job. And like I said with parents, it takes very little effort sometimes to just reach out. If you're in fifth grade and sixth grade, you're going to transition to middle school. By fourth and fifth grade, you should have met the middle school principal by now. You really should have a relationship, an email relationship at least. We've
Mhm.
done at least one transition meeting with parents at both schools with everybody present.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have done at least one field trip with the kids to go over to meet everybody. You should have been on that, or you should at least send somebody on that so that they have a feeling. That's the kind of relationships you definitely want to honor as you move through these systems. Because again, forearmed is forewarned. If you know that something might be a stressor, get on it ahead of time so it doesn't
Mhm.
sneak up on you. Because
Yeah.
when you're raising kids, there's no time for anything else, really.
Yeah. That's great advice, emphasizing those relationships. Is
Yep,
Mhm.
that, did you do that,
it's
Andrea,
all.
ever reach out to the board for your kids' schools?
I didn't. I did
Yeah.
go to meet the principals and such as they transitioned between, but then my daughter in fifth grade, we moved her to private.
And one of the things we didn't get to really touch on was private versus public. But at some point, we could probably have another conversation around that
Yeah.
because I think that's an important understanding for parents to have because that
Yeah.
is an option for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of this is new for me because my kids did go through private. And when they had mental health challenges and we had to work closely with the school, we didn't go through an IEP for 504 process. It was so different and
Mm-hmm.
templated to a degree and highly accommodating. Actually, it's just called an accommodation plan. But yeah, that's why all these conversations I'm learning all the
Yeah.
time because
Yeah.
Well, you know,
we went a
interestingly
different way.
enough, the private that we were in first
Mm-hmm.
led me to go back to the public school system to get those accommodations because that private was not giving us what we needed. We eventually had to move schools again. But that was the reason I had learned, was because I was like, they're not they're not giving me what I need. And what I realized was they don't have to.
Right.
They really don't.
Because they don't take public money. They
Right.
don't take taxpayer money, and so they don't have to follow educational code. They don't have to follow government mandates. Public schools do. And so when we talk about your rights as parents, those rights don't necessarily exist in the private setting. They exist in the public setting. And so, you know, that's something that, again, we'll do another podcast.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll have to go on to the,
we'll get into all that, because it's fascinating stuff and it's good to know. There are pros and cons of public and private, and it'd be great at some point to delineate all those for your listeners, for sure.
Absolutely. I want to make a clarification. The private school system did end up working for my daughter later on, and there are a lot of privates that do offer accommodations. But again, at another time, we should really talk and explore the differences there.
Yeah, let's do that.
Brian, we hope to have you on again.
I would love to. I think what you guys are doing is awesome. Keep it up. Don't give up. This is hard work, but it's going to be worth it. You'll be happy down the road that you did this.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Brian.
thank you. That means a ton.
All right. Thank you, guys.